I am Suzanne Griffith. I am a board member of the African American Legacy Foundation at the Chicago Community Trust, and I chair the grants committee. And so thank you for joining today as we roll out a new opportunity for funding to grassroots organizations. So this should be a fairly brief presentation of just what our guidelines are, and then we'll be able to take a few questions at the end. So with that, we'll get started. So you may be familiar with the African American Legacy Fund, but we've been around for over 10 years or so, almost 15 years. We are what they would call an identity fund of the Chicago Community Trust. Over the last several years, we will typically make a RFP and then request proposals for funding. We specifically fund organizations and work that impact and affect the African American community in the Chicago area. What we're going to cover today is the focus area for this particular grant cycle, some definition and terms that we want to be very explicit about, the timeline, which I'm sure you're thinking is a pretty fast turnaround, and it is, and then we'll be able to take a few questions and answers from you all. Over $2 million in grants awarded at this point in time. We've worked with a number of grantees of varying sizes, typically smaller organizations, and we continue to do engagement activities that have involved, more than 500 or so nonprofit organizations. So to get right into our grant cycle, this year we will be proposing 3 focus areas. One is social justice, and particularly training and education of young activists. The second is around immigration, as it affects the African diaspora. So policy, systems change, and direct service within that area. And thirdly, organizations working on mental health, specifically those responding to street, gun, and police violence. We are very focused on having organizations that are Black-led, Black-serving, and specifically grassroots organizations. So I'll go into what we mean by Black-serving. The constituents that your organization is working with would be predominantly Black, African American, and or from the African diaspora. So as it relates to immigration, you can imagine those organizations that are working with resettlers, refugees, foreign natives from other countries within the diaspora, within the Caribbean, etc. Black-led, this is important for us. What we mean here is that the staff and the board leadership are Black. We would like to see in the application, for example, a breakdown of your board member profile as well as key staff profile. And then thirdly, another critical definition is what we mean by grassroots. From a budget perspective, we're looking at, for applications in the range of $50,000 to up to $2.5 million budget. And then as we talk about grassroots, there's more information within the RFP in terms of some definitions that we're using from the Grassroots Grant Makers organization. So place-based, you're focused on a particular geography. There may or may not be an informal structure. This grant cycle is open to those organizations who may not yet be formally incorporated as a 501c3. It will be important, though, that you have a fiscal agent. Duration, some grassroots organizations are, they have a long-term outlook, and some organize specifically for just a temporary period to work on a task. So we're open to that. And then membership, the notion that those upon who you are working understand and are part of that mission. All right, and then moving on to application requirements. The application is online on the Trust website. It will ask you for a logic model. It's a fairly simple logic model. The idea is that you are able to explain to us, what outcome you are looking to affect and what your process is to get there. You will be asked for a current year operating budget. So that would be for most organizations who probably have a fiscal year beginning July 1. Fiscal 2018 operating budget. If you're on a calendar year, then it's still fiscal 18. Your previous 12 months operating statement. What we're looking for here is not necessarily an audit, but of course, if you have an audit, please feel free to include that. But we want to see what your previous immediate 12 months were. A project budget, if you are proposing a project, specifically what the budget is related to that. The board list, and as I mentioned, the board composition matrix to help us identify how you define yourselves as Black-led. To reiterate, you do not have to be a 501c3 to apply, but you must have a fiscal agent. Other questions, we're trying to anticipate some of the questions. So this is a one-year grant. Right now there is not a notion of renewing. We are doing a one grant cycle at a time. If you have been a previous grantee of AAL and you currently have a grant with us, you may not be eligible. This is only one grant from AAL at a time. You may, though, perhaps have a grant from the Chicago Community Trust. And then you can apply for either project support or general operating support. All right. So you guys may be more familiar with this part than I am, but if you've applied to the trust for a grant, this screen may be familiar. You may already have a login, but you would want to start here at Grant Central, create your login information as referenced on this slide, and it will be available online as well. There's a tutorial to help guide you through the login to Grant Central. So I'm going to jump to the logic model. This may be familiar to several of you, but what it does is really drives you to think about, how you are looking to, what outcomes are you looking to have, and how will you get there? The next slide, which is a better explanation, is an example of a logic model. And I'm going to pause for a few minutes just so that if you're looking at your screen, you can read this. For those of you who are on the phone, I'll say a few things to guide you through this. All right, so for those of you who may just only be on the phone, the goal of this organization is to increase the number of students completing their GED by 30%. The first column in terms of outputs is what does it take to have a student complete a GED? So you need a teacher, you need the curriculum, you need a room, you need supplies. Output. Once you put those things together, what might you have? Instruction, students in the classroom, homework assignments, and then you estimate what percentage of students, would show up for this, what percentage of students would complete the class, and then you can project perhaps what percentage of students might pass the GED. All with the interest in thinking about your short-term outcome. Your students will pass the GED. Longer, medium-term outcomes is that with a GED in hand, they could go on to pursue other educational goals. And then long-term, the increasing the number of GED participants who then can go on to secondary education ultimately results in increased assets, income, family living wage, et cetera, in terms of a social goal. So I know I went a little fast on that. It's much easier to view than it is to listen to. And again, this presentation will be online for your review and for your study. All right, so I am almost at the end of our talking part, and then it'll be an opportunity for you all to ask any questions, especially those questions that may not yet have been covered in the material. The deadline for the application is Wednesday, May 9th by midnight online. Applications submitted after the deadline will not be accepted. As you can imagine, this is an online system, so it probably just will not let you submit it. And there is not an option to drop it off on paper the old-fashioned way. After this webinar, if you have questions as you're working on the application, those can be directed to Nicole Layton here at the Chicago Community Trust, who is a liaison with the African American Legacy Fund. And her contact information is also in this presentation.
Dominica, a couple of questions. One, for the general operating support, what kind of information are you looking for as far as programs? Because you want people to fit in one of those 3 areas. So do you just want a description of how we fit into one area, and is that enough for the general operating, or is there something more specific or overarching that you're looking for?
What I would say is that if your overall work fits into those 3 areas, then that is how we would want to understand your work in terms of its general operation. So if you have one very small program that may fit one or 1 or 2 of these areas, in a larger organization, I would encourage you to think about the definition around grassroots, as well as the requirements as it relates to budget and Black serving, Black leadership.
Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
Are you accepting applications from organizations that operate with less than $50,000?
Our guideline around grassroots begins at the $50,000 mark.
That's a very high grassroots milestone. If you're defining grassroots, I don't know how you reach that level for grassroots. There are a lot of organizations that are operating that consider themselves to be grassroots that are operating with less than $50,000.
We understand your concern. At some point, there's a cutoff that the argument can go either way, right? So we sort of have to put some definition to it. And so the budget range for this particular grant cycle starts at $50,000 and goes up to $2.5 million.
What if I have a follow-up? What if you collaborate with another organization, such as a school or a library, park district? Would that qualify you?
Would that qualify as?
Meeting the requirement of $50,000.
All right, so the lead organization on the application would have to meet the application requirement.
Okay, that's workable.
Can you hear me? I have a question. I didn't quite hear it well. We were a grantee for about 2 or 3 years ago. Can we apply now with this grant? We no longer, we were funded under the auspices a couple of years ago, but no longer funded.
You may be eligible. If you are a current grantee of AAL, it would not be eligible. However, if you have been previously funded by AAL, you can take a look at the guidelines and submit. if you find a fit.
Thank you. So so I understood the grant amount, the minimum and maximum for the budget size, but I missed the part if it was given of what amount we can apply for. What's the max we can apply for?
Thanks for that question, Victoria. You know, I actually didn't cover that. We are anticipating grants in the range of $5,000 to $10,000.
Okay, grant size 5,000 to 10,000. Okay.
Yes, good question. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit more about the category of social justice and what you're looking for with education and training of youth activists?
What does that mean for that?
Sure. So, you know, right now, as we kind of scan the landscape, we know that in these political times and just, you know, local, national politics, et cetera, there is great attention and activity around what Suzanne would describe as resistance. And so as young people get more involved in policy work, activist work at their neighborhood, local level, the organizations that are working with them to really help provide that training and get them organized are organizations that we're interested in looking at in this grant cycle.
And what do you consider as youth? Youth, what age range are you looking at as youth?
I would say that
in general.
Sure, the top end of the range is probably up to 22 or 24 years old.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
And can you choose either of these 3 areas listed in your announcement?
I'm sorry, was that a question?
Yes. So
Can you repeat the question, please?
Grant can be targeted for either of the 3 areas that you listed.
Yes, you are able to apply within any of the 3 areas, and to the degree that you may be working for some reason in all of those areas, we would encourage you to, you know, provide that explanation so that we're able to understand your work as clearly as possible.
And how many grants are you planning on giving out for this cycle?
That's a good question. This is the first time in a long time that we've just done an annual cycle of grants, and given the grant size, we don't yet know what to anticipate. We're curious about that too, but thank you for the question.
One of our projects would be in preparation for a more in-depth project for your social justice category. Would that fit within your general model?
You have a project within a project under social justice?
Basically, yeah.
It sounds like it could. I would encourage you to, again, think about all of the application requirements and the grant requirements. So hearing no additional questions at the moment, I would like to say on behalf of the African American Legacy Fund, thank you very much for joining this info session. Good luck with your applications. We look forward to reading them.